Hi guys. Today I have a book called Henry's Freedom Box, a true story from the Underground Railroad. So we talked about this before school was closed about how a long time ago in our country, African American people were used as slaves and they were thought of as property. And there was an Underground Railroad, which wasn't a railroad at all, but a system of homes that helped slaves escape from the South and come to the North where they were free. And this is a true story of a slave named Henry who escaped. And it's written by Ellen Levine, and the illustrations are by the great Kadir Nelson. His illustrations are absolutely beautiful, as you can see here, and they won a Caldecott Award. Henry's Freedom Box. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from trees like slave children are torn from their families. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Most slaves were freed by their owners. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe his master would set him free. But the master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. So Henry didn't get his hope to be set free here. The master decided to give Henry to his son. Can you imagine someone deciding that you were like a property, a thing that you could just give away? Like, oh, here's a Pokemon card. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. Just like his mother said, slaves were often separated from their families. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. Mistress is like the female version of master, so those would be the master and the mistress were the slave owners. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. What do you think is happening here? Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, then another, and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Think about this for a minute. They had to get agreement from their owners, from their masters to get married. And now they're worried about them selling their children. It's a scary position to be in. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco." The boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. He can't even leave his work to go see what's happening because he'll get beaten. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves was tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. Father! Father! Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped his tears, Nancy, too, was gone. Henry could no longer sing. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew he had the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought that slavery was wrong. White people at that time who thought slavery were wrong were called abolitionists, and they helped slaves escape to freedom. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves, he said. James stared at the box, then at Henry. What if you cough and someone hears you? I will cover my mouth and hope, said Henry. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, to William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, this side up with care. That means treat it carefully. Don't bang it around too much. Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. No, cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. So just to be able to stay home from work, he had to make himself really severely injured by pouring like a acid type of thing on his hand. The sun was not yet up when Henry climbed into the box. Ready, he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst. But he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. And there you can see, like as if the box were glass and you could see into that crate, you can see what poor Henry looked like squished up in there. Tired of standing, someone said. Why don't we move that box and sit on it, said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side, now his left, and suddenly he was right side up. What do you think is in here? Said the first man. Mail, I guess, said the other. I am mail, thought Henry, but not the kind they imagined. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time head up. He fell asleep to the song of the train wheels. Henry awoke to loud knocking. Henry, are you all right in there? All right, he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. Four men smiled at him. Welcome to Philadelphia, they said. And that's the end. He made it to freedom. Now, I do want to read you the author's note in the back because that's not the end of the story of Henry. Oh, and I'm sorry, I missed this last page. At last, Henry had a birthday, March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Box Brown. And it says here in the back, in the mid 1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Slaves were owned like tables or cows or wagons. Historians believe between 60 and 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom traveling on what was called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad. It was all the secret ways slaves made their way from the South to the North. They hid in carts, rode on horseback, walked, this makes me sad, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps and crossed flowing rivers in summer and icebound rivers in winter. Conductors, like on a train, you have a conductor who opens the doors and stuff, and station masters hid them and helped them throughout their journey. When Henry Brown climbed into his freedom box, he hoped he'd be carried to a safe world. He brought along a small tool to make air holes, a little water, and a few biscuits. Henry arrived in Philadelphia having traveled 350 miles from Richmond, Virginia in 27 hours. His story made newspaper headlines in America and Europe. Henry never found Nancy and his children. In 1850, he went to England, and there are some reports that he married again. We do know with absolute certainty that Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, the man who mailed himself to freedom. Okay, be kind to everybody, guys.